Summer of 1988. A parking lot outside Chicago. 12 Soviet visitors step off a bus and see the golden arches glowing red and yellow against the sky. They stop, they look at each other, and they start to laugh. These weren't tourists. They were factory managers, trade officials, a Communist Party journalist. Serious people sent to study American industry. But McDonald's, this looked like a toy. A food factory for children. One engineer joked it reminded him of propaganda cartoons mocking shallow American culture. Their American guide smiled and said, "Let's just try it." Inside, a teenage girl in a visor handed them a picture menu. They ordered. 90 seconds later, hot food appeared on a tray. A Big Mac, fries, a Coke. $2.50 total. Victor, the factory engineer, unwrapped the burger, stared at it, and the laughter stopped. Back in Moscow, a good meal took 2 hours. You needed reservations. You waited in line. The food arrived cold. Here, a 17-year-old kid just served them lunch faster than their best state restaurants could seat them. One of them whispered in Russian, "How is this possible? If a burger can shatter everything you were taught about the West, what else were they wrong about?" Hit subscribe if you want more Cold War stories the history books left out. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I love seeing how far these true stories travel across the world. Summer arrived, hot and humid, in 1988, the kind of Midwest heat that made the air shimmer above asphalt parking lots and turned car interiors into ovens if you left the windows up too long. The Cold War was entering its final strange phase, a period historians would later call the Thaw, when Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policies cracked open doors that had been welded shut for decades. Cultural exchanges became possible again, carefully monitored visits where Soviet officials could tour American factories, attend academic conferences, even walk through shopping malls with State Department escorts trailing a respectful distance behind. The goal, at least officially, was mutual understanding. The reality was more complicated. Both sides were still sizing each other up, still looking for weaknesses, still half convinced the other was performing an elaborate deception. Which is how 12 Soviet citizens found themselves climbing off an air-conditioned tour bus in a suburb outside Chicago on a Thursday afternoon in late July, squinting against the bright American sun. They were not diplomats or politicians. They were working professionals, factory managers from Leningrad and Kiev, trade ministry analysts from Moscow, production engineers who spent their days wrestling with broken machinery and impossible quotas. There was also Dmitry Sokolov, a journalist from Pravda, the Communist Party newspaper, a man in his early 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather notebook he kept tucked in his jacket pocket. Dmitry had built a comfortable career writing articles that praised Soviet industrial achievements and gently mocked American consumerism as shallow and spiritually empty. He was good at his job. His prose had a rhythmic certainty to it, the kind of writing that made readers nod along even when the facts were thin. Their American guide, a State Department cultural liaison named Robert Henderson, had arranged a full itinerary: steel mills, automotive plants, a printing facility, even a modern supermarket. Bob spoke fluent Russian with a slight Moscow accent he'd picked up during his posting in the 70s, and he'd learned over the years that the best approach with Soviet visitors was patience mixed with quiet confidence. Never argue, never gloat. Just show them things and let them draw their own conclusions. He knew most of them arrived expecting to see homeless people on every corner, begging children, workers in rags. When they didn't find that, when they instead found ordinary middle-class Americans living in single-family homes with 2 cars and full refrigerators, it created a cognitive dissonance that no amount of propaganda could easily explain away. That afternoon's schedule called for lunch before the factory tour. Bob had suggested McDonald's partly for convenience. It was right off the highway, but also because he'd noticed over multiple delegations that fast food restaurants seemed to crystallize something important about American abundance and efficiency in a way that formal presentations never could. The Soviets always reacted strongly, sometimes with disgust, sometimes with fascination, always with surprise. As the delegation crossed the parking lot toward those famous golden arches, Viktor Petrov pulled out his pocket watch to check the time. Viktor was 47, built like a boxer who'd stopped training, but still had the shoulders with deep-set eyes that missed nothing. He managed production lines at a tractor factory in Leningrad, which meant he spent 60 hours a week fighting entropy, broken conveyor belts, missing parts, workers who didn't show up because they were standing in bread lines instead. He'd grown up during the war, remembered real hunger, remembered his mother boiling potato peels to make soup. He believed in the Soviet system with the kind of faith that came from having nothing and building something, even if that something never quite worked the way it was supposed to. When Viktor saw the McDonald's building with its bright primary colors and cartoon simple design, he started to smile. Then Dmitri said something that made the others laugh, a joke about American food factories, about how this looked like a toy restaurant for toy people. Anna Mikhailovna Kozlov, the trade ministry analyst, laughed too, though hers was quieter, more polite. She was a practical woman in her early 40s, mother of 2 teenagers back home, and she'd learned to navigate the casual cruelty of group dynamics by going along without committing too hard. Either way, the laughter spread through the small group like a release valve. They'd been on their best behavior all week, nodding seriously at presentations, asking diplomatic questions, maintaining the careful face you wore when representing your country abroad. But here in this parking lot, looking at this ridiculous building with its plastic playground and drive-through window, they could relax into shared contempt. Bob Henderson heard the laughter but didn't react. He'd heard it before. He held the door open and gestured them inside with the same mild courtesy he'd shown all week. The blast of air conditioning hit them first. American buildings were always so cold in summer, a luxury that still felt slightly obscene to visitors from a country where even Moscow's best hotels ran hot in July. Then came the light. McDonald's in 1988 was designed around brightness, white walls, yellow accents, fluorescent fixtures that eliminated every shadow. It looked nothing like a Soviet restaurant where dark wood and dim lighting created an atmosphere of serious dining, where meals were events that required proper clothing and proper behavior. Behind the counter, Jennifer Martinez was working the register. She was 17, a high school senior with her dark hair pulled back in the required neat ponytail, wearing the polyester uniform and paper visor that somehow managed to be both embarrassing and oddly dignified when you wore it well. Jenny had worked at this McDonald's for 8 months and had gotten good at reading customers fast, who was in a hurry, who needed extra patience, who was going to complain no matter what you did. When she saw the group of foreign visitors walk in, clearly uncertain, she shifted into her helpful mode automatically. She smiled, made eye contact with the woman in front, Anna, and slid a picture menu across the counter without being asked. The menu board glowed above Jenny's head, backlit panels showing perfect photographs of Big Macs and Quarter Pounders with prices printed in clear numbers beside each item. Viktor found himself staring at those prices. Big Mac, $1.60. Large fries, 89 cents. Large Coke, 75 cents. The numbers meant nothing and everything. He did the math automatically, converting dollars to rubles at the official exchange rate, then at the black market rate, then trying to calculate what this represented in purchasing power in hours of labor. His monthly salary was about 180 rubles. A good pair of shoes cost 60 rubles, and you waited months to find them. But the real shock wasn't the money. It was that the prices were just there, printed on the wall, the same for everyone. No negotiating, no connections required, no standing in line hoping supplies hadn't run out. Anna stepped forward and ordered carefully, pointing at pictures, her English uncertain but functional. The young woman behind the counter never stopped smiling, never showed impatience, just punched buttons on the register with practiced speed. 2 minutes passed. Then a teenager in the back called out an order number, and suddenly there was a tray, and on that tray was hot food wrapped in paper printed with the McDonald's logo. Viktor checked his watch again without thinking. 90 seconds from order to delivery. 90 seconds. In Moscow, you made reservations 3 days in advance and still waited an hour to be seated. They found a booth and sat down, the plastic seats designed for quick turnover rather than comfort. Victor unwrapped his Big Mac slowly, aware that the others were watching, that this had become some kind of test none of them had agreed to take. The burger looked exactly like the picture on the menu, which seemed impossible, like a magic trick he couldn't figure out. He picked it up and took a bite. It was hot. Actually hot. The meat tasted like real beef, properly seasoned, cooked through but not dry. The cheese was melted. The lettuce was crisp and cold, shocking in its freshness. Where did they get crisp lettuce in July? The whole thing tasted good in a simple, uncomplicated way that required no analysis, no appreciation of technique. It was just food that worked exactly as promised. Nobody was laughing anymore. Victor finished his Big Mac in silence, then did something that surprised even himself. He asked Bob Henderson if they could see the kitchen. In Soviet restaurants, kitchens were hidden behind closed doors, off-limits territories where food appeared from mysterious processes you weren't supposed to question. The secrecy served a purpose. If customers couldn't see the broken equipment, the questionable hygiene, the corners cut to make quotas, they couldn't complain with specificity. But here, Bob just smiled and said he'd ask the manager. 2 minutes later, a man in his mid-30s wearing a tie and a McDonald's manager badge approached their table. His name was Tom Williams, and he spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. He said they were welcome to tour the kitchen, that he'd be happy to explain how everything worked. The offer felt like a trap, except there was no edge to it, no gotcha waiting. Tom seemed genuinely proud to show them. They followed him behind the counter, past the registers where Jenny was already helping the next customer, into the operational heart of the restaurant. What Victor saw made him stop and stare. It was an assembly line. Not metaphorically, actually, literally an assembly line. The same principles he used to build tractors applied to hamburgers. The kitchen was divided into stations, each with a specific function. The grill area had timers mounted on the wall, loud beepers that went off every 37 seconds. A teenager in a McDonald's uniform, couldn't have been more than 16, was flipping burger patties with mechanical precision, 10 patties per batch, each one getting exactly 37 seconds per side. The kid never looked at a clock. He just knew. His hands moved in patterns that came from repetition, from doing this exact task hundreds of times until it became muscle memory. Tom walked them through the process like he was giving a factory tour, which in a way he was. The buns went into a toaster for 35 seconds, no more, no less. The fries cooked in oil heated to exactly 365 degrees for 2 minutes and 45 seconds per batch. The assembly station had everything laid out in sequence: bottom bun, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions, top bun, wrapper. A trained crew member could assemble a Big Mac in 15 seconds flat. Tom said it with pride, the way Victor talked about his best production line workers, the ones who could strip and rebuild a transmission blindfolded. The difference was that Tom's workers were children. Not literally children, but teenagers, high school kids earning spending money. In the Soviet system, restaurant cooks trained for months, sometimes years. Chefs were craftsmen who took pride in their skills, who worked their way up through rigid hierarchies. Here, a 16-year-old could reach full productivity in 2 or 3 days. Dmitri pulled out his notebook and started writing, his pen moving fast across the page. Victor could see him struggling with the same cognitive dissonance that was making Victor's chest tight. They were factory men, both of them in different ways. They understood production systems, efficiency metrics, throughput calculations. What they were seeing was brilliant from an engineering standpoint: standardized inputs, precise timing, minimal waste, maximum output. But it also felt wrong in a way Victor couldn't quite articulate. Where was the skill? Where was the human judgment that separated a good cook from a bad one? This wasn't cooking. This was manufacturing. Tom said this single restaurant served about 1,500 customers per day. The number hung in the air like an accusation. The best state restaurant in Moscow, the kind where party officials ate, maybe served 150 people on a good day, and every one of those customers had waited. Anna asked a question in careful English. How old was the youngest worker? Tom said 16, that most of his crew were high school students working part-time. They made minimum wage, $3.35 an hour, but they got flexible schedules, free meals during their shifts, and a chance to move up if they worked hard. He pointed to one of the assistant managers, a young woman named Maria who was 22. She'd started at the grill 4 years ago, worked her way through every position, and now she ran entire shifts when Tom wasn't there. The pride in his voice was real. He saw nothing shameful in this system. To him, these were good jobs that taught young people responsibility and work ethic. To Anna, watching a 16-year-old flip burgers under a timer's pressure, it looked like something else. It looked like childhood sacrificed to the machinery of capitalism. Young people turned into cogs before they'd had a chance to become fully human. But then she noticed something that complicated her judgment. The teenagers were smiling. Not the forced smile of someone performing for inspectors, but genuine expressions of people who didn't hate their jobs. Jenny at the register laughed at something a customer said. Two crew members in the back were joking with each other while assembling orders, their hands never slowing down, somehow managing to maintain perfect speed while also being human. Maria, the assistant manager, gave instructions to a newer employee with patience, showing him how to fold the burger wrapper correctly, demonstrating it twice without any hint of irritation. This wasn't a gulag. These kids weren't being exploited in any visible way. They were just working, the same way teenagers everywhere worked. Except here, the work was organized with a precision that made Soviet factory managers envious. Victor found himself timing everything with his watch, unable to stop himself. From order placement to food delivery, the average was 3.5 minutes. He watched one customer walk in, order, pay, receive food, and walk out in 4 minutes total. The efficiency was almost offensive. In Moscow, a meal at a decent restaurant took 90 minutes minimum, often 2 hours. You went to a restaurant because you had time to spend, because eating was a social ritual that couldn't be rushed. Here, eating was refueling. The word Dmitri had written in his notebook kept rattling around in Victor's head. Food factory. That's what this was. Industrial production applied to nutrition. Americans had solved the problem of feeding millions the same way they'd solved mass production of automobiles. Standardize everything, eliminate variation, train workers to do one task perfectly rather than many tasks adequately, optimize for speed and consistency rather than artistry. They returned to their table and sat down again, the food mostly eaten now, the wrappers crumpled on orange plastic trays. Around them, the restaurant hummed with constant activity. Families came in, kids in tow, everyone knowing exactly what to order because the menu never changed. Business people on lunch breaks, eating alone, reading newspapers while they chewed. An elderly couple sharing a small fries, taking their time despite the design that discouraged lingering. The crowd was diverse in a way that Soviet restaurants never were. Young and old, well-dressed and casual, all mixing together in this bright plastic space. There were no reservations required here. No connections to call, no waiting lists, just walk in, order, eat, leave. The democracy of it was almost invisible because it was so complete. Victor noticed the trash. Americans were throwing away food. Half-eaten burgers went into garbage cans. Barely touched fries dumped without a second thought. In the Soviet Union, food waste was almost criminal. You cleaned your plate because food was precious, because you remembered the war years, because wasting what someone else might need felt morally wrong. But here, abundance had made people careless. A teenage boy dumped an entire uneaten burger because he'd ordered the wrong thing. Nobody looked twice. The casual waste bothered Victor more than the efficiency. It spoke to a different relationship with resources, a confidence that there would always be more, that scarcity was a problem someone else had solved permanently. Bob Henderson had been quiet, letting them process, but now he mentioned something that made the scale click into place. There were 8,800 McDonald's locations in the United States as of 1988. The company served roughly 23 million customers every single day. Victor did the math in his head. That meant McDonald's alone, just this one company, fed 7% of America daily. The entire Soviet Union had maybe 2,000 state restaurants in Moscow, most with limited hours, frequent shortages, and waiting lists for popular locations. The comparison wasn't even close. It was embarrassing. Dmitri closed his notebook and looked out the window at the parking lot, at the steady stream of cars pulling up to the drive-thru, at the smooth functioning of a system that somehow worked despite employing teenagers and operating at a pace that should have caused constant disasters. Anna spoke quietly in Russian, almost to herself. "Is this civilized?" The question lingered. They'd seen something that worked, that fed millions efficiently and consistently, but it had required sacrificing something they couldn't quite name. The human element, maybe. The sense that a meal should be more than fuel. That feeding people should involve more than precise timers and standardized procedures. Nobody answered her question because nobody knew the answer. They just sat there in the bright fluorescent light, surrounded by the sound of happy customers and beeping timers, feeling the weight of what they'd witnessed pressing down on assumptions they'd carried their entire lives. The fries were still hot when Victor picked one up, studying it like a specimen under laboratory conditions. It was golden brown, perfectly uniform in color with tiny crystals of salt visible on its surface. He bit into it and the exterior cracked with an audible crunch, giving way to soft potato inside that was fluffy and steaming. Every single fry on his tray looked identical. Same length, same thickness, same color. He picked up another one and it tasted exactly like the first. Then a third, exactly the same. The consistency was unnerving. In Moscow, even at the best restaurants, food varied from day to day, meal to meal, depending on what ingredients were available, which cook was working, what mood they were in. Variation was expected, even valued as a sign of human craftsmanship. But here, the food had been engineered to eliminate variation entirely. These fries weren't made, they were manufactured. Anna had ordered a filet-o-fish and was eating it slowly, trying to understand what she was tasting. The fish was hot, breaded and fried to a crisp golden brown, topped with a slice of processed cheese that melted into the steaming fillet. A dollop of tartar sauce, cold and tangy, spread across a soft, steamed bun. It shouldn't have worked. It was too simple, too industrial, too obviously mass-produced, but it tasted good. Not interesting or complex or worthy of conversation the way a properly prepared fish dish might be back home, but satisfying in an immediate, uncomplicated way. She thought about her children, teenagers now, and how they would react to this meal. They would love it, she realized. They would love the speed, the brightness, the casualness of it all. The thought made her sad in a way she couldn't quite explain. Dmitri had barely touched his quarter-pounder. He was watching the dining room instead, his journalist's eye cataloging details. The restaurant held maybe 60 people at full capacity, and right now every seat was taken with a line forming at the registers. But people weren't staying long. The average customer sat for maybe 15-20 minutes, then cleared their trash and left. Immediately, someone else took their seat. The turnover was constant, efficient, relentless. He started counting, timing the flow with his wristwatch. In 1 hour, this room would cycle through roughly 150 people, maybe 200 during peak lunch rush. The math was staggering. A Soviet restaurant this size might serve 30 customers in an hour on a good day, and half of them would have reservations made days in advance. Through the window, he could see the drive-through lane. Cars were lined up 4 deep, and he watched the system work. A car pulled up to the speaker box, placed an order he couldn't hear, drove forward to the window, paid, received a bag of food, and drove away. Start to finish, maybe 3 minutes per vehicle. No one got out of their cars. They just ate while driving, steering with one hand and holding hamburgers with the other, treating food as something that happened between other activities rather than as an activity itself. The efficiency was impressive and deeply disturbing at the same time. Americans had optimized eating the same way they'd optimized manufacturing, removing every unnecessary step, every moment of friction, until the entire process approached the theoretical minimum of time and effort required. Victor finished his fries and found himself studying the other customers. A family sat 3 tables over. Mother, father, 2 young children, maybe 6 and 8 years old. The kids were eating Happy Meals from boxes printed with cartoon characters, small toys scattered on the table between them. They were laughing, playing, completely comfortable in this space. The parents looked relaxed, not stressed about money or timing or whether the food would arrive. This was normal for them, routine, nothing special. Victor tried to imagine bringing his own family to a restaurant in Leningrad. First, you'd need to know someone who could get you a reservation. Then you'd dress up because restaurants were formal spaces. Then you'd wait, always wait, even with a reservation. The children would need to behave perfectly because Soviet restaurants didn't tolerate noise or play. The meal would cost a significant portion of your monthly salary. And the food, when it finally arrived, would be cold more often than hot, because the kitchen was overwhelmed and understaffed and working with equipment that broke down constantly. Here, feeding a family was so easy it barely counted as an event. The father glanced at his watch, said something to his wife, and they started gathering trash. 10 minutes, maybe 15, and they were done. The whole family had eaten a full meal for probably under $10, which was what, a few hours of work at an average American wage? Victor knew the numbers. Median household income in America was around $27,000 a year. That meant this meal represented maybe half an hour of labor. In the Soviet Union, a comparable restaurant meal would cost the equivalent of 5 or 6 hours of work, assuming you could even get access to the restaurant in the first place. The waste bothered him again. The family left behind a tray piled with trash, crumpled wrappers, a mostly full container of fries the children hadn't finished, 2 full packets of ketchup no one had opened. The father just picked up the tray and dumped everything into a large garbage can near the exit, the whole mass of paper and uneaten food disappearing without ceremony. Victor found himself wanting to tell them to save those fries, to wrap them up and take them home, that food was precious and shouldn't be treated so carelessly. But of course they wouldn't understand. They lived in a country where abundance had become so normal it was invisible. They couldn't see the miracle of it because they'd never known scarcity. Anna was watching the same family, but she'd noticed something different. The mother had smiled at her children with patience and ease, not the tight, stressed smile of someone managing scarcity, but the relaxed expression of someone whose basic needs were met and solved. Soviet mothers, Anna included, carried a constant low-level anxiety about resources. Do we have enough food for dinner? Are the stores out of milk again? Should I join that line even though I don't know what they're selling because it might be something we need? The weight of managing scarcity ground you down over years until you couldn't remember what it felt like to not be tired. But American mothers seemed lighter somehow, freed from that particular burden because the system had solved the problem of basic abundance. Bob Henderson stood up and suggested they should probably head to the next stop on the schedule. The factory tour was supposed to start at 2 and they were cutting it close. The delegation gathered their things slowly, reluctantly, still processing what they'd seen. As they walked toward the exit, Victor paused at the garbage can where the family had dumped their trash. He looked down at the uneaten fries, perfectly good food just thrown away, and felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like grief. Grief for all the times he'd stood in line for hours to buy bread. Grief for his workers who couldn't get lunch at the factory cafeteria because supplies ran out by noon. Grief for his children who'd never eaten a meal this fast or this cheap or this consistently good. They climbed back onto the bus and sat in silence as Bob started the engine. Through the window, Victor watched another family walk into McDonald's. The golden arches glowing in the afternoon sun, the parking lot full of cars, the system humming along with mechanical precision. Dmitri opened his notebook and wrote a single question in Russian. Is this food or is this fuel? He underlined it twice, then closed the notebook and stared out the window. Nobody spoke. The air conditioning blew cold and steady, and outside the American summer continued, bright and hot and abundant, feeding millions without anyone noticing the miracle of it anymore. Anna thought about her daughter back home, 15 years old and already learning to stand in lines, already learning to manage scarcity with the grim, competent Soviet women passed down through generations. She thought about how excited her daughter would be to eat here, to order from a picture menu and receive hot food in 90 seconds, to be treated with kindness by a smiling teenager who didn't care about your connections or your party membership or whether you knew the right people. The simplicity of it would seem like magic. Anna felt tears building behind her eyes and turned to face the window so no one would see. The bus pulled out of the parking lot and merged into traffic, carrying them away from McDonald's and toward the rest of their carefully planned itinerary, but the weight of what they'd witnessed rode with them in silence, heavy and undeniable as stone. That evening, back at the hotel in downtown Chicago, the delegation gathered in Dimitri's room without anyone explicitly organizing the meeting. It just happened the way these things did when people needed to process something together when the official schedule ended but the questions wouldn't stop circling. Someone had brought a bottle of vodka from the duty-free shop at the airport and they passed it around in small glasses meant for water, the ritual of shared drinking creating a space where they could speak more freely. The room was generic American hotel. 2 double beds with floral bedspreads, a television bolted to the dresser, air conditioning that hummed too loud, carpet that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. Through the window, Chicago's skyline glowed against the darkening sky, a forest of lit windows in buildings so tall they seemed impossible. Victor spoke first, his voice rough from the vodka. He said the system was brilliant from an engineering standpoint, that he'd never seen production efficiency applied so completely to a service industry. The standardization, the timing, the division of labor, it was textbook industrial design, the kind of thing Soviet planners talked about but never achieved because the infrastructure wasn't there to support it. He'd spent 30 years trying to make factories run smoothly, fighting against broken supply chains and equipment that hadn't been maintained properly and workers who were drunk because they were demoralized because the system was broken. And here was McDonald's, staffed by teenagers, running with precision his best production lines couldn't match. The admission hurt. He could see it in his own face reflected in the dark window, the way his jaw was tight, the way he couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. Dimitri countered immediately, his journalist's instincts reaching for the ideological framework that had always served him before. He said yes, the system was efficient, but at what cost? Those workers had no dignity. They were cogs in a machine, performing repetitive tasks that required no skill, no creativity, no human judgment. A 16-year-old flipping burgers under a timer wasn't learning a craft. They were being trained to be obedient to mechanical systems, to subordinate their humanity to corporate efficiency. In the Soviet Union, a chef was an artist. A cook had pride in their work. Yes, the service was slower, but it was human. It had soul. The words came out practiced, smooth, the same arguments he'd written in dozens of articles. But even as he spoke, Dimitri could hear the hollowness in his own voice. He was performing certainty he didn't feel anymore. Anna sat on the edge of the bed, holding her untouched glass of vodka, and said quietly that she kept thinking about the teenage girl at the register. Jenny, the manager, had called her. She'd been so kind, so patient, taking genuine pride in doing her job well even though the job was simple. Anna had watched her interact with customers. The smile never looked forced, the efficiency never looked frantic. Jenny seemed happy. Not pretending to be happy for inspectors or supervisors, but actually content in that moment, doing that work. Anna said she couldn't stop comparing it to Soviet workers who moved through their jobs with dead eyes, going through motions because the system crushed initiative and rewarded only compliance. Maybe dignity didn't come from the complexity of the work. Maybe it came from being treated well, being paid fairly, having a choice about whether to be there. The room went quiet. Someone poured another round of vodka. Outside, car horns echoed. Up from the street below, the constant sound of American traffic that never seemed to stop even at night. Victor said something that surprised everyone, including himself. He said his factory back home was failing. Not officially, you couldn't say that out loud in reports, but everyone who worked there knew the truth. The equipment was 40 years old and breaking down constantly. Replacement parts took 6 months to arrive if they arrived at all. The cafeteria ran out of food by noon most days, so his workers spent their lunch breaks standing in line at state stores hoping to buy bread or meat or whatever was available. Morale was terrible. Production quotas were met only by falsifying reports, and the tractors they built were garbage, breaking down in fields across the country because the quality control was non-existent. He'd spent his entire career serving the Soviet system, believing in it, defending it, and now he couldn't ignore what he'd seen today. McDonald's worked. His factory didn't. The comparison was that simple and that devastating. Dmitri started to argue, reaching for the familiar defenses about capitalist exploitation and spiritual emptiness. But Anna cut him off. She said she was tired of pretending. She had 2 teenage children at home who were growing up in a system that couldn't even keep milk in the stores consistently. Her daughter had never eaten a banana because tropical fruit was effectively unavailable except to party elites. Her son wore shoes 2 sizes too small because finding children's shoes in the right size required connections she didn't have. She loved her country. She believed in the ideals of socialism, inequality, and collective welfare. But the system wasn't working. It wasn't feeding people efficiently. It wasn't providing basic abundance, and pretending otherwise didn't help anyone. The vodka bottle was empty now. They sat in the dim light of a single lamp, 3 Soviet citizens far from home, facing truths that felt like betrayals. Dmitri finally set down his glass and admitted that he'd been writing propaganda for 20 years, that he knew the articles he published were lies, that he justified it by telling himself the cause was righteous even if the specific facts were bent. But today, watching ordinary Americans eat lunch with casual ease, seeing the abundance and efficiency that made feeding millions look effortless, he couldn't maintain the cognitive dissonance anymore. The system he'd spent his career defending was broken. Not morally broken, he still believed in the ideals, but practically broken, unable to deliver basic services that Americans took for granted. Victor asked the question that had been haunting him since they left McDonald's. How was it possible? How did America manage to build a system that fed 23 million people daily through a single restaurant chain when the Soviet Union, with all its central planning and collective resources, couldn't consistently stock bread in Moscow stores? What did they know that Soviet planners didn't? What had they figured out about supply chains, about logistics, about organizing human labor that remained mysterious to the system Victor had devoted his life to? The questions weren't rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to understand, wanted to bring answers home, wanted to fix the broken machinery of Soviet production before it ground to a complete halt. Anna said maybe the problem was that Soviet planning tried to control everything from the center, making decisions in Moscow about what bread should cost in Vladivostok, creating systems so rigid they couldn't adapt to local conditions or changing circumstances. McDonald's worked because it was flexible within its standardization. Local managers could adjust staffing based on actual demand. Supply chains responded to real consumption patterns rather than planned quotas. Prices reflected actual costs rather than ideological pricing. The system had room to breathe, to adjust, to respond to reality rather than trying to force reality to match the plan. They talked until after midnight, circling the same questions, the same uncomfortable realizations, the same sense that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of the world. Nobody said out loud that they were beginning to doubt the Soviet system itself. That was still too dangerous, too complete a betrayal, but the doubt was there in the room with them, heavy and undeniable. When they finally said goodnight and returned to their separate rooms, each of them lay awake in unfamiliar beds, staring at unfamiliar ceilings, thinking about golden arches and teenage workers and food served in 90 seconds, wondering what it meant that a hamburger had shaken their faith more than any propaganda ever could. The next morning arrived cold and gray, rain drumming against the hotel windows in steady sheets that blurred the Chicago skyline into suggestion. Victor woke early from restless sleep, his mind still churning through everything they'd discussed the night before, all the uncomfortable questions that had no safe answers. He dressed and went down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast, expecting to find it empty at 6 in the morning, but Anna was already there, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a plate of food she wasn't eating. She looked up when Victor approached and gestured to the empty chair across from her. They sat in silence for a moment, the awkward quiet of people who'd said too much the night before and weren't sure where they stood now in the morning light. Anna finally spoke, her voice soft and tired. She said she'd been awake most of the night thinking about her children, about what kind of future waited for them in a system that couldn't even manage to keep stores stocked with basic goods. Her daughter wanted to study engineering like Victor, was brilliant with mathematics and spatial reasoning, but Anna worried there would be no opportunities, that talent didn't matter as much as connections, that the whole system was calcifying into something rigid and dead. She said she missed home terribly, missed her husband, missed the familiar streets of Moscow, missed speaking Russian without having to think about every word, but she also felt something she'd never expected to feel on this trip. She felt envious. Not of American wealth or American politics or American ideology, but of American normalcy. The simple, boring ease of walking into a restaurant and getting food without drama or waiting or shortages. Victor ordered coffee from a waitress who filled his cup without being asked, the small gesture of American service so routine she probably didn't even think about it. He told Anna about his wife back home, about how she spent hours every week standing in lines, how the constant hunt for basic supplies had worn her down over the years until she was always tired, always worried, always calculating what they needed versus what might be available. He said his wife was a doctor, a smart woman who'd trained for 7 years, and now she spent her limited free time queuing for toilet paper and butter like everyone else. The absurdity of it hit him fresh. Sitting here in this American hotel where the breakfast buffet offered 10 different choices and the coffee kept coming without anyone having to ask. Dmitri joined them 20 minutes later looking worse than either of them, his eyes red-rimmed behind his glasses. He sat down heavily and said he'd been writing in his notebook, trying to draft the article he'd need to file when they got back to Moscow. Usually the words came easily. He knew what the party wanted to hear, knew the formulas that satisfied editors and kept him out of trouble. But this time he couldn't make the pieces fit. He couldn't write the dismissive piece about shallow American consumerism when he'd watched ordinary families eating together in a clean, bright space, served by workers who seemed content rather than oppressed. He couldn't mock American efficiency when that efficiency was feeding millions while Soviet systems struggled to feed thousands. The propaganda lines felt like lies in his mouth now, and he didn't know how to write around that without writing something dangerous. Bob Henderson found them an hour later, sitting together over empty coffee cups, and he suggested something that wasn't on the official schedule. He said if they wanted, they could go back to McDonald's that morning. Not the same location, there was another one just a few miles away that opened at 7 for breakfast. He said it casually, like it wasn't a significant offer, but they all understood what he was really proposing. A chance to look again. A chance to test whether yesterday's impressions held up or whether they'd been just exhausted and disoriented by travel. A chance to see if the system really worked consistently or whether they'd just witnessed a particularly well-run location putting on a show. They went. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time they climbed into Bob's sedan, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm as they drove through suburban streets, coming awake in the early morning. This McDonald's looked identical to the first one, same golden arches, same red and yellow color scheme, same glass windows and plastic playground. They walked in at 7:15 and found it already doing steady business. Construction workers in hard hats grabbing breakfast before their shifts, office workers in suits ordering coffee to go, families with small children eating Egg McMuffins at booths near the windows. Victor ordered an Egg McMuffin and hash browns without consulting anyone, his English better today, more confident. Anna got hot cakes and sausage. Dmitri ordered the same as Victor, watching the counter crew work with the same precision they'd seen yesterday, the same practiced movements, the same impossible consistency. Their food arrived in under 2 minutes. The Egg McMuffin was hot. The cheese melted perfectly over a round egg and Canadian bacon on an English muffin. Victor ate it slowly this time, paying attention to every detail. It was identical to every other Egg McMuffin served that morning in every other McDonald's across America. Thousands of restaurants, millions of sandwiches, all exactly the same. The scale of it was staggering. This time they didn't go into the kitchen. They just sat and watched. Three foreigners observing a system that revealed itself through simple repetition. They watched the morning rush build and fade, customers flowing through in steady waves, each transaction taking 3 or 4 minutes from door to exit. They watched the crew change shifts at 8 o'clock, new workers arriving and sliding seamlessly into the same roles, the system continuing without interruption because the system didn't depend on any individual person's skill or knowledge. They watched families eating together before school and work. The parents relaxed and unhurried because feeding everyone breakfast had taken 5 minutes total and cost less than an hour's wage. Anna noticed something she'd missed yesterday. There were other Soviet visitors there, or at least other Eastern Europeans. She spotted a family speaking what sounded like Polish, and a couple conversing in what might have been Czech. They looked just as overwhelmed as she felt, just as stunned by the casual abundance on display. She wondered how many people from behind the Iron Curtain had sat in McDonald's restaurants over the past few years, watching this same system work, feeling the same uncomfortable questions taking root. How many had gone home and tried to explain what they'd seen to people who'd never left the Soviet Union, who couldn't imagine food arriving in 90 seconds, or prices printed clearly on a wall, or teenagers running efficient production lines? How many had failed to find words adequate to the task? Victor finally broke the silence and said something that surprised Anna and Dmitri both. He said they needed to be honest when they got home. Not recklessly honest, he wasn't suggesting they write reports criticizing the Soviet system or the party, but honest in their recommendations about what could be learned, what could be adapted, what needed to change if their own country was going to survive. He said McDonald's wasn't just a restaurant. It was proof that abundance was possible, that feeding millions didn't require some impossible miracle of planning, that the problem wasn't scarcity itself, but how systems were organized to deal with scarcity. Soviet planners needed to study supply chains, standardization, decentralized decision-making, worker training, inventory management. Not to become capitalist, but to make socialism actually work the way it was supposed to work. Dmitri nodded slowly, thinking about the article he still needed to write. Maybe there was a way to frame this that was honest without being dangerous. Maybe he could write about learning from American efficiency while maintaining Soviet values. Maybe he could argue that the best response to American success wasn't denial, but competition, using these lessons to build something better at home. The words were starting to come now, forming themselves into sentences that might survive editorial review while still containing some truth. They sat there until almost 9 o'clock, watching America eat breakfast with mechanical ease, feeling the weight of what they'd witnessed settling into something more permanent than shock. This wasn't a performance or a trick. This was just how things worked here, day after day, millions of meals served without anyone thinking it was remarkable. The ordinariness of it was the most extraordinary part. They finished their coffee and stood to leave, and Victor turned back one last time to look at the restaurant humming along without them, serving the next customer and the next, endless and efficient as a heartbeat.